everyone, my name is Gayathri and I'm a third year biotech major at UC Davis. About a year ago, I made a video titled STEM Class Reviews with Gayathri, which was just me going over all of the STEM classes I took as a freshman. Now I've come back with a similar video where I discuss all the STEM classes I took as a sophomore. So if you are going to take the Chem 118 series, Stats 100, Mike 102, Mike 103L, or BIS 101, keep watching because we'll be doing another deep dive. For each class, I'll be going over the general class content, workload difficulty, which I'll rank 1 to 5, 5 being most difficult, class difficulty, which I'll also rank between 1 to 5, and then finally, any general advice I have for doing well in the class. Keep in mind, as I say with all of my videos, take everything I say with a grain of salt. This is just a video I'm putting out to help you guys get a general idea of how these classes work. When it comes to your performance in the class, honestly, a lot of it does depend on what teacher you end up having, what subject matter you're comfortable with, sometimes even the combination of classes you take together. This video is probably going to be just as long as my last one, so please feel free to stop the video at any time, come back and watch it multiple times if you need to. And I will be dropping timestamps below, so if there is a specific class you're interested in, don't worry, you can just go to that section. Another thing, I did take a lot of notes, so I will be looking at my phone as I go through everything, because I just want to make sure I get every point across. With that all said, let's get started. So starting with fall quarter, the two classes that I took was Chem 118A and Stats 100. So Chem 118A is organic chemistry for biological sciences. That is right, we are finally starting off our OChem year. So you'll be learning the basics of OChem, which is going to be naming molecules, stereochemistry, spectrometry, and certain mechanisms like SN1, SN2, E1, E2. A lot of this may not make sense as I'm saying it, that's okay, you'll learn all of it when you take the class. When it comes to workload difficulty, I ranked it a 3 out of 5, okay? Just hear me out. Chem 118, this is an upper division class, right? They say upper division is easier just because there's less homework, and I do agree that there is significantly less homework, but that doesn't make the class any less difficult. With Chem 118A, we literally just had 5 discussion quizzes a week. That was our only homework. And even then, it's not even homework, it's quizzes. So the entirety of your Chem 118A grade is based on exams. We had about 2 to 3 lectures a week, and then a weekly discussion that's about 1.5 hours long. There is no lab for this particular chem class, but there will be for the other OChem classes. Even though your entire grade is based on exams, objectively, there is no homework assignments, so I couldn't give it such a high rating. But when it comes to class difficulty, I gave it a 4 out of 5. Your grade based on 5 quizzes, 2 midterms, and a final, which is cumulative, and then grades are curved. Personally, I feel like OChem material is not as difficult as people say it is. Okay, when I walked into the class, I thought it would be impossible to pass. But in reality, what makes OChem difficult is it's a mix of memorization and critical thinking. On top of that, there's so many little details you need to know for every question. Let's say you want to name a molecule, right? You need to know what the longest chain is, you need to know the ordering, you need to know prefixes, suffixes, you need to know spelling. When it comes to mechanisms, you have to know like which arrow pushes to which atom. I gave this class a 4 out of 5 instead of a 5 out of 5 because honestly, the teacher you have can make or break your experience. But the material, if you practice it enough, you can totally master it. And I'll be getting into that now with my general advice. First thing is please use the AATC. AATC is the Academic Assistance and Tutoring Center. Your tuition money goes towards funding this program, which means that it's not necessarily free, but it's like you're paying for it already, might as well utilize the resources. And I do feel that the AATC has provided wonderful resources for OChem. On their Google Drive, they have workshop videos, which are basically, they just go over lecture content in those videos, and they do it a very thorough job. And then they have practice exams, they have practice worksheets. The problem that I had with OChem is I felt like my teachers didn't provide enough practice, so I did rely on the AATC a lot. Unfortunately, I only found out about the AATC halfway through the quarter, so if I had used it earlier on, I felt like my grade could have improved. So definitely use their Google Drive, use all of the worksheets they have. They also hold office hours, so if you want to go attend their office hours, I would definitely make use of it. Second piece of advice I have, please, for the love of God, you need to practice every day. Okay, I'm not joking. You have to practice OChem a little bit every day or else you're not going to make it. I'll be straight up with you. I did not get an A in this class, and I felt like a huge reason was because I wasn't putting in enough time into OChem every day. OChem, it's not a class that you can procrastinate for because, as I said, it's a mix of memorization and critical thinking. Not to mention there's so many little details that you have to keep track. You need to make it a reflex, essentially, and you can only do that if you get enough practice and enough exposure. Even for me, even waiting a week before the midterm to study was just not enough. If I had done a little bit of practice every day, I felt like my grade could have significantly improved. Third piece of advice, I probably said this 30 times in my last video, but definitely go to office hours. Another mistake that I made in this class is I wasn't holding myself accountable for the information I didn't know. A lot of the times I would do practice problems that were either too easy, and if I found something difficult, I would look at it and just brush it off and say, oh, it's not gonna show up on the exam. One thing I did my freshman year that I wish I did this year was if there was a problem I didn't know, no matter how insignificant it may seem, I would still note it down and I would go to office hours and ask about it. Another problem that I had is I didn't go to office hours regularly. For my first midterm in OChem, I went to every office hours and I got an A in that midterm. But then for the second midterm and the final, I didn't attend office hours that much and I didn't do as good. In fact, I did significantly worse on my second midterm and final than on the first midterm. So I felt like if I had taken accountability for the stuff I didn't know, and if I went to office hours to clarify, I felt like I could have gotten a significantly better grade. You don't have to go to the professor's office hours all the time. There are TA office hours, and like I said, the AETC also holds office hours. So it's all about kind of experimenting, trying out who works, and then committing to going to their office hours every day. This is gonna be the difference of just passing and possibly getting an A in the class. Final piece of advice, as far as study materials go, I used a mix of flashcards and practice worksheets. You will get questions on exams that are content-based that you won't necessarily get in a practice worksheet. So you wanna make sure that when you're watching lectures, you take note of all of basically not the problems, the actual content, the information. Make sure you take that down, write it in a flashcard, memorize it. And then, like I said, working on practice worksheets every day is essential. You need that exposure and you need that comfortability in order to do good on the exam. Okay, so that was OChem. Now we're gonna move on to Stats 100, which was statistics for biological sciences. So class content-wise, although it's an upper division class, it's an intro to stats class. So you'll be learning about probability, you'll be learning certain statistical tests like p-tests, or like calculating p-value, t-tests, chi-square tests. You'll also learn to use this software program called RStudio. And we mainly use this for the homework assignments. You'll be given a data set, you have to input it into the program, type in certain code, and then you'll come up with different results for different statistics tests. Workload difficulty, I gave this class a 3.5 out of 5, so it was slightly higher than what I put for OChem. This is because we had weekly homework assignments. It was just a worksheet that you get completion points for, as well as accuracy for maybe 2 or 3 randomly selected problems. And then when I took the class with my teacher, we had a couple quizzes a week, which were very, very short. There were 3 questions, online Canvas quizzes, completely open note, very simple. Although that there were more assignments in this class than with OChem, I did feel like the assignments were very reasonable. Even better yet, a lot of them were reflective of what shows up on exams. The way the class is structured is we have a standard 2 or 3 lectures a week, depending on your teacher, and there is an optional 50-minute discussion. When it comes to class difficulty, I gave this class a 3.5 out of 5. This is because we have 2 midterms, 1 cumulative final, and there's no curve in the class. We do get our lowest homework score dropped, and then when I did all of those short quizzes, we took 20 short quizzes by the end of the year, or by the end of the quarter, and our teacher dropped the 5 or 6 lowest ones. So that kind of boosted my grade by maybe 3%, that's a good amount. Honestly, this is probably one of the better math classes I've taken. It's not that it's really easy, it's just, I think what made this class more simple is that all of the problems we would get, all of the examples that our teacher would go over in class would be very, very similar to what shows up on the exam. All of the problems that we were exposed to, I thought if you had practiced them enough, you would definitely get, I'd say, a B+ or A- in the class, 100%. However, I did give this class a 3.5 out of 5 only because of course you have to go the extra mile in order to get the highest grade. Like, I know when reviewing for exams, I would go over our PowerPoint slides and like there was certain like very obscure pieces of information that our teacher probably went over for 2 seconds, and I would keep that in mind, and then when I go into the midterm, like it shows up and I'm like, oh my god, we did not go over this often enough. And also some of the concepts were kind of difficult to understand too, like some of them didn't make sense, but besides that, I definitely feel this class, it's really manageable. General advice I have, first point I made, is to take all of the example problems the teacher went over, go home to your dorm, to your apartment, wherever, get a worksheet or get a piece of paper, write out all of the example problems, but don't look at your notes and answer. Basically, write out the example problems, answer them on your own, then look back at your notes to see if you did it correctly. And again, the only reason why I'm saying this is because whatever example problems our teacher went over in class, they were very similar to the problems that show up on the exams. Second point I have is to obviously do the practice exams. Our teacher usually gave us like one practice exam from previous quarters. I think it's just really helpful to get a grasp of how the test is structured, how the problems may look like, how many problems there are, and definitely I would go over the practice exam as though you're taking the real exams. Go to a private room, maybe time yourself, take the whole exam, don't look at notes, see how you do. Third piece of advice is to go to office hours for any homework problems you don't understand. I know for me, I think I did really good on my first midterm because there were a certain set of problems that I just didn't know how to solve. Like, I didn't know what tricks to use, and my teacher showed me a really cool trick during office hours that got me to nail those questions every time. You can also go to office hours to see if there are any other ways you can approach problems. Overall, I thought this class was okay. I liked it more out of any math class I took because I thought there was more real-world application. And because the stuff we learn in statistics, if you're gonna go work at a research lab, you're going to see p-values there. I know in some of my classes after stats, especially bio classes, they went over chi-square tests and p-values. So definitely I would say out of any math class, statistics is the most applicable. It's definitely a pretty manageable class. Okay, we are done with fall quarter and now we're moving on to winter quarter. I took Chem 118B and Mike 102. So Chem 118B, it's the second class in the OChem series. Class content, very, very, very mechanism heavy. The amount of reactions you will have to learn, arrow pushing mechanisms, is absolutely unbelievable. You'll still have to know nomenclature, you'll still have to know spectrometry, but majority of this class is just learning how to write mechanisms. You'll specifically learn about reactions with alkenes, alkynes, and carbonyls, but I'm literally not kidding though. Like, all of this class, it's literally just like taking electrons from one molecule, moving it to the other molecule, and doing that like 10 times within one reaction. That's literally majority of this class. Workload difficulty, I gave this class a 3.5 out of 5. So you have your standard lectures, which are either 2 times a week or 3 times a week. And instead of a discussion section, we do have a lab. The lab is 3 hours long and weekly. And for each lab, you have a pre-lab and post-lab assignment. Labs in OChem are kind of different compared to the Chem 2 series. For starters, your pre-lab assignment, you don't have a pre-lab write-up. It's just like, it's an assignment that's on the lab website. A lot of it is just like writing down the safety precautions, writing down the physical properties for each compound. So the pre-lab is really simple, but the post-lab, I would say, is more challenging than what you did for Chem 2, because in the post-lab, a lot of the questions were explanation-based. You had to write down, why does this thing happen in the reaction? And I would say it was less calculations based like how it was for Chem 2. You also, in this lab, you don't have a partner. So technically everything, all of the labs that you do in this class are alone. Of course you can collaborate with your lab mates. I always did, but you have to perform the procedures alone. So you will have to watch these videos in advance, going over how the different lab experiments work. But yeah, the only assignment in this class would be the pre-lab and post-lab assignments, which are weekly. Otherwise, everything else is just exams. When it comes to class difficulty, I gave this class a 4 out of 5. So just like with Chem 118A, we have 2 to 3 midterms a quarter. This depends on your teacher. My teacher let us do 3 midterms a quarter, and then we could drop one. But yeah, you have 2 to 3 midterms a quarter, then 1 cumulative final, and the class is curved. Again, why a 4 out of 5? There are so many mechanisms you have to understand. This is different than Chem 118A, because in 118A, at least you learn a little bit of a lot of different things. But with 118B, it's just straight up, you're given reactants, you're given a product, figure out the steps you need to get there, or it's, I've given you the reactant reagent product, tell me how the mechanism works. The thing is, I ended up doing better in this class than in Chem 118A, and I felt like this class had more, if you're someone whose strength is memorization, you'll have a better time. When you learn how to memorize the different mechanisms, you'll be able to recognize it better when you see it on the exam. I think another reason why I did well in this class is because I only took 12 units that quarter. But I do feel that 118B, at least for me, it helped that there was more of a memorization aspect. Because you definitely need to learn how to memorize these reactions. So I think if you're like me, I think you'll have a better time in 118B. General advice I have, number 1, when I took notes for this class, I used a lot of gel pens and, color-coded a lot of the reactions. So yeah, I used a lot of color coding, and then the way that I would review for this class is I would take a piece of paper with the mechanism I wrote down, I would get a whiteboard, and I would just look at the name of the reaction, and then I try to recall how the mechanism works on my whiteboard. I look back at my notes to see if I got it right. This is the first step you have to take in studying for this class, but it's most certainly cannot be the only thing you do. Definitely, if you want to do well on these exams, you need to have memorized mechanisms by, the week before the midterm. Once you hit a week before the midterm, this is when you really have to work on practice problems. I wish one thing I could have changed is really setting that hard cutoff, that a week before the midterm, I should have memorized these mechanisms perfectly. And then for that 1 week, I'm just gonna be doing practice problems. What I was doing was 3 days before the midterm, I would be working on practice problems for the first time, which is not helpful. Getting the mechanisms down is just the preliminary. That's obviously the first thing you need to do, but you have to apply it to new problems. Second piece of advice goes back to the AATC. For professors who don't give enough practice problems, I would use the AATC Google Drive. They do have an insane amount of practice problems there. There are certain problems you will see on exams that if you don't get enough practice, you're not gonna do well. My first midterm, I did really bad. And that's because I just did not get enough practice in. You'll have to know how to do synthesis problems, which is just, you get your reactant, you get your product, and you have to show all of the steps that it takes to get there. Those are probably the most difficult problems on exams, and if you don't get enough exposure to the mechanisms, you're not gonna do well. It's probably the most stressful problems for me on exams. Final thing, if a teacher gives you a study list for the exam, I would just focus on that. With so many reactions, there's no way you can test a student on all of them. So what my teacher would do is he'd give us a study list of, out of everything that he taught us, what are the things we should prioritize? And I would base my studying around that. I'm talking for the people who really are on a time crunch. If you are on a time crunch, if you did procrastinate a bit, that's okay. Just make sure that you use the study list first, because that's what the teacher's going to prioritize. Okay, with that, we're done with Chem 118B, and now we're moving on to Mic 102, which is Intro to Microbiology. Class content, literally everything related to bacteria, fungi, protists. You'll be learning about classifying bacteria, We'll be learning about different structural and metabolic functions of microbes. There's a lot of DNA regulation, DNA replication, transcription, translation, stuff like that you'll have to learn. I always say Mike 102 is Biz 2A on steroids. Workload difficulty, I say it's a range between a 3 out of 5 to a 4 out of 5 because it really depends on the teacher you have. My teacher, we had 2 lectures a week, no discussion, no lab, nothing like that. We would get reading assignments, like online reading assignments, but they were completion based. And our teacher would make it very clear that you don't really have to read too hard, just skim the pages a bit, answer the reading questions. We were given multiple chances, so purely completion based. But there are some teachers who make you take quizzes, like graded quizzes based on the reading, so it really varies. Class difficulty, I gave it a 4 out of 5. So it's your classic 2 midterms, 1 final kind of situation. Technically, there can be a curve because it depends on how the class does, right? But I think when I took microbiome, there wasn't that big of a curve, so I would not rely on that. My exams, they were all multiple choice, but there are some professors who want to spice things up and put short answer on there. One of my friends had a professor who had a collaboration section on the exam where you get with a group and you have to answer a problem on the exam and you all will get like the same score based on it, stuff like that. I'm honestly not sure, but it really depends on the teacher for how the structure of the exam works. Content-wise, like I said, it's Biz 2A on steroids. The number of enzymes and processes and reactions, this was 100% a very difficult class compared to the Biz 2 series. So I always say, don't think that just because you did really good in the Biz 2 series, it doesn't mean that you're gonna slide by in Mike 102, because there's just too much to understand and it's way too convoluted. Only because of a bunch of extra credit reading assignments did my percentage in the class get pretty high, but I remember the first midterm I didn't do so well. It's because I underestimated the class. So general advice I have, first thing would be to utilize flashcards. Flashcards, they will be your best friend. Since it is a bio class, there's a lot of memorization, so if you want to utilize active recall, it's better to use flashcards. I think diagrams would also be really helpful because you will be learning DNA replication, DNA transcription translation, so you'll have to know the location of where all of that is happening. You'll have to know like which molecules bind where. Second piece of advice, like I said, in my case, the first midterm, I didn't do as well as I wanted, but the second midterm and the final, I did really good in. And the one difference I made is I really honed in on the lecture slides. My teacher also, he really emphasized that his exams are purely based on lecture content. What I did is I would go open his PowerPoint slides. I would just read the title of each slide, try and recall as much information as possible. I would even say it out loud, which is another really good way of studying, is to just talk it out. And then I would look back at the slide to see if I missed any information. A lot of the times, there was just very similar to Stats 100. There were some very very tiny details in certain lecture slides that I completely passed over my head when I first listened to lectures, and then when I read it again and I see it on the exam, I'm like, thank God I looked over it. Third piece of advice, please study a little bit every day. Just like with OChem, there are way too many little details you need to know for this class. The number of enzymes, the number of molecules, and the names for the molecules are also really confusing. Like just so many names and so many processes, they'll all get jumbled up together if you don't review each thing. Like the enzymes for rolling circle replication are not the same for like horizontal gene transfer, like whatever it is, you need to make sure that you get all of those little details down. Final piece of advice, again, go to office hours and please clarify anything that you don't understand. When I had to learn gene regulation with tryptophan and like rolling circle replication, none of that made any sense to me. So I know like going to office hours really helped with that. Walk into this class understanding that there's going to be a lot of things you don't know. There's going to be a lot of new things you will learn. I think one issue I had is I thought this class was going to be easy because that's what I was hearing from everyone. It's like, oh, Mike 102, it's not a big deal. And let me tell you, this class, as it progresses, it gets more and more difficult. Especially second unit stuff like DNA. The DNA regulation stuff is really difficult. difficult. Walk into this class being prepared to work hard. Okay, and now we are on to our final quarter, spring quarter. Here I took Chem 118C, BIS 101, and Mike 103L. So Chem 118C, this is the final class on the OChem series. It's very similar to Chem 118B. You'll notice that as I go over the class content, workload difficulty, all that. It's also very reaction heavy, but we go over carboxylic acids, amines and amides, sugars, and proteins. Workload difficulty, 3.5 out of 5. It is the exact same setup as Chem 118B, where you have 2 to 3 lectures a week, a weekly lab, pre-lab, post-lab assignments. For class difficulty, I gave it a 4 out of 5, which is, again, basically the same as the other two OChem classes. Very, very, very similar setup to Chem 118B as far as exams go. I had the same teacher for 118B and C, so it was literally like same 3 exams a quarter, final. I would say the kind of reactions for this class were slightly more advanced than 118B, but as far as how to study for the class, it's exactly the same. I will emphasize again though, please make sure that you're done memorizing mechanisms at least a week before the midterm. My grade in 118B and C were like less than 1% different, and I did nearly the exact same stuff, but again, I wish I had given more time for this class. I was taking 16 units that quarter too, which is maybe why I found it difficult to manage time, but again, just, studying for the class, make sure that you give enough time to work on practice problems. When it comes to all other general advice though, you can go back and look at the Chem 118B section because a lot of it's very similar. Okay, now on to BIS 101, which is genes and gene expression. Class content, you will learn literally everything about genetics. You'll be learning the probability of certain genotypes, quantitative and qualitative genetics, population genetics, reading pedigrees, gene regulation, so on and so forth. Honestly, there is a decent amount of material from Mike 102 that was in BIS 101, especially the DNA processes and gene regulation. A lot of it was really, really similar. So when those units came up, I didn't feel like I had as difficult of a time. So I would definitely suggest taking BIS 101, Mike 102 back to back, like one after the other, because the classes align a decent amount. Overall though, this class, I will say, it's very much problem solving based and less memorization based, which for a lot of people, they're not used to that with a bio class. One of the first things that our teacher told us when we started the class is treat it like it's a math class and less of a bio, like a standard bio class. Workload difficulty, I gave it a 2 out of 5. Why such a low number? Because we had absolutely 0 assignments. Literally, your entire grade was 2 midterms and a final. There's no homework. So I don't even know why I'm giving it a 2 out of 5. It should honestly be a 0 out of 5. There is an optional discussion section. So when you sign up for this class, you'll be signing up for the lecture, but then you have the option to sign up for a separate discussion section, which I would highly recommend. The teachers will give recommended homework problems at the beginning of the week, and some of those problems will be selected or like they'll let you know these are the problems that you need to turn into discussion, and you do that and you get completion points for it. But yeah, otherwise when I took this class, if you are only taking the lecture, it's just going to be exams. Class difficulty, I gave this a range between 3 out of 5 and 4 out of 5, similar to Mike 102. And I say that because the teachers for this class very much vary in how well they teach, basically. I feel like genetics, if you have the right person explaining it to you, it's not that hard. But I was on my own for this class, okay? Like, the whole time I was in this class, I didn't go to a single lecture, I just studied the textbook. And so many of the concepts were just so difficult to understand alone that you need a good teacher. You always need a good teacher. Okay, when it comes to grading, like I said, you have 2 midterms and a final. Our teachers gave us a really, really, really good curve. Like, when I took it, a 78% was an A-, which that is an insane curve. So definitely they'll compensate depending on how the class does, but I think sometimes there's a curve, sometimes there isn't. If you have good professors, genetics will be pretty straightforward, but if not, this is the most difficult bio class you'll take. I mean, I guess there's biochemistry, but I haven't taken that yet. But out of all the bio classes I've taken so far, definitely BIS 101 is the most difficult, then Mike 102, then the BIS 2 series. General advice I have, like I said, unlike other bio classes, you have to treat this like it's a math class. This will probably be the first thing that professors tell you. This will be the first thing TAs will tell you, is literally treat it like a math class, work out every problem, and make sure you get enough exposure to a lot of problems. I will say, if you've taken a stat class before, there are certain concepts that will be easy to understand. And if you're good with probability too, I think you'll have a decent time in this class, because in this class there is a lot of finding the probability that this phenotype shows up, or we have to use chi-square tests in this class. So that's what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about SAS 100, is it is applicable in these situations. First piece of advice I have, the best way to get a good grade in this class is to do all of the assigned homework problems. This again is a class where when the teachers give you homework problems, it tends to be reflective of the exams, more or less. In this class, the textbook was really helpful. All of our homework problems, not all of them actually, but most of them were from the textbook. So definitely working out every assigned homework problem, not just the ones that you need for your discussion. I did not attend a single lecture in this class. The entirety of my education for BIS 101 was done through the textbook, and I still ended up with a pretty decent grade. And that's why I say, if you work out all of the homework problems, if you go to office hours and ask anything you're doubtful about, you will do well in this class. I completely relied on the textbook. I would work on the homework problems, I would redo the homework problems before the exam, and apparently that was enough to land a decent grade. Second piece of advice, just like math, just like OChem, you have to keep practicing. Even if you find your professor's lectures helpful, doing as many homework problems as possible will give you the exposure and the comfortability when you actually take the exam, because you'll see a problem and you'll be like, okay, I have done this before. Third piece of advice, one thing that I wish I did was go to office hours more often. Honestly, this whole year we were kind of lacking on that. I was talking about office hours all the time as a freshman, and this year I only went to maybe 3 or 4 a quarter, when I usually would go every week. But I did find TA office hours especially helpful for this class. You can go to the professor's office hours too, it just depends. But for me, I thought the TAs did a pretty good job. Even if you don't have questions, you should still go, because other people will have questions, or sometimes you didn't even realize you had a question until someone else brings it up. Okay, and finally, the last STEM class of this year is Mike 103L, which is Microbiology Lab. Class content, this is a class that you take after you have taken Mike 102. So it's kind of unique from other lab classes. If you think about OChem or Gen Chem or Gen Bio, you have a lab section built into the class, right? But with Mike 102 and Mike 103L, the lecture is taken separately and the lab is taken separately. And you usually do it in 2 different quarters. So that means with this class, it is purely lab-based. Everything you learn and everything you do is just centered around the lab. You'll be learning how to do all hands-on things, like inoculating bacteria into petri plates, into tubes, incubating bacteria. You'll be running certain metabolic tests on them, you'll be viewing them under a microscope, stuff like that. Workload difficulty, I give it a 2.5 out of 5. So this class consists of 1 weekly lecture and then 1 3-hour lab section. We did have weekly post-lab assignments. Our teacher called them transit visas. So the way it would work is you'd get access to these transit visas before the lab, but they're due at the end of lab, which means you should work on it in advance, and then if you want to change anything, you can. Every assignment that you do, you'll be working with a group on it. So in this class, everything is group-based. You'll be in a group of 4, doing all the labs together, submitting all the homework assignments together. Even the biochemical lab practical, that's a group-based thing. Class difficulty, I gave it a 3.5 out of 5, which is at the same level as stats and possibly Mic 102. So there are 2 midterms and an online lab practical, but nothing is cumulative and everything is online and OpenNote. Even though all the exams are OpenNote and online, why did I give it such a high score? Because your entire grade is based on 100 points and there is no curve. So your post-lab assignments, which are the transit visas, the 2 midterms, and the lab practical, they all come together and factor into these 100 points, which means that even if you miss 10 points, that's a different letter grade. The midterms, when I took it, had 19 multiple choice questions and each one was worth 2. So the whole idea of the multiple choice being worth multiple points itself also, I thought, made the class kind of difficult. The lab practical was worth 6 points, and in the lab practical, your job is you'll be given a bacteria and you'll be told like, oh, it exhibits these kind of, you know, this color, this shape, blah, blah, blah. And you have to figure out, you have to run metabolic tests on it, and then you have to figure out what bacteria it is. But the thing is, this is an all or nothing lab practical. If you identify the bacteria correctly, you get all 6 points. If you identify it incorrectly, you lose all 6 points. Majority of people would say, don't worry, you know, this class is easy, you'll have a good time, and you will, but because the grading is so high stakes, you cannot leave room to miss much. General advice, number 1, is make sure you pick the right group of people to sit next to during your first lab day. All of your transit visas, your biochemical lab practical, it's based on the people you work with. And obviously, when you perform the labs in person, it depends on who you work with and how you divvy up the work. So you want to make sure that you find people who put in their fair share of work, who get things turned in on time, who know what they're doing. Second piece of advice about the transit visas, the ideal way to complete them is to finish it before lab. The way the transit visa grading works is you'll complete it, let's say you get a rough draft of it done before lab. You complete lab, you clean up your station, then your TA will come around and you'll show him your transit visa assignment. And by then they'll tell you what questions are correct, what questions are incorrect, and then you'll be given 48 hours to make any corrections and submit. And each transit visa is worth 3 points. But the thing is, TAs, they're very, very picky about grading. If you spell something incorrectly, if you use the wrong font, the wrong punctuation, whatever it is, like, maybe not wrong punctuation, but you know, like the very little things, or if you don't explain something correctly, they will take off a point for that. And you want to make sure that at the end of lab, you have plenty of time to discuss it with them. I would highly not suggest waiting until the end of lab to even start the assignment because you're not going to get it done. You want the opportunity for the TA to see it, because if you turn it in, you could end up losing like a point or 2 points. And if you consistently do that, keep in mind, like your grade is based on 100 points. So like 10 points and you're already at the lower letter grade. Third piece of advice, for midterms, although they are open notes, I would take your own notes. I think there's just too much information in all of the lecture notes. It gets too overwhelming when you're in the middle of taking an exam. You can't control F your way through it. You know, you can control F some of it, but I highly suggest synthesizing the notes on your own. What I would do is I would look through all of the lecture notes and then I would write it all out, handwrite it, and categorize it. Like, oh, this is all my notes about procedures. This is my notes about physical characteristics. And this is my notes about what each test does. And I will literally lay it out on my bed. And then when I'm taking the online quiz, if I need to go back and refer to something, I can just grab the right sheet and look at it. Because you don't want to be flipping from tab to tab on your computer trying to get the answer to. Another thing is that the way the exam questions are structured, they're meant to be really confusing and long and filled with details. You want to make sure that you pinpoint, like, what are the things I need to know? What are the clues I get in the question? By going over your notes again and writing out your own notes, that's already a way of studying. And then finally, for this class, I do suggest going to lecture, because my professor, he would post an audio version of the lecture afterwards, which you can still listen to that, I also knew people who never looked at lecture and would just show up to lab, but I do think in lecture, my professor did a good job of like reviewing information, because when we got our notes for the class, they were really, really confusing, but when he went over it in lecture, it just became so much more simplified. So I definitely think it's worth it to go to lecture in this class. Okay, we have made it to the end of the video. If you stuck around for the whole thing, thank you so much for watching. It was very long, and taking the time to watch it is something I really appreciate. I'll be transparent, second year humbled me. When I made my video of all of the STEM classes I took as a freshman, I was so hyped up. I was ready to go. But now as I'm making this video, I'm just looking back and I'm like, God, man, it was rough. It was really rough. Although my experience with these classes were, my experience, I hope that you were able to gain some valuable information from all of the advice I shared, or even the way the classes worked. Please take everything I say with a grain of salt. There might be some stuff I said that may not relate to you. There might be classes where I thought it was more difficult, you find it easier, or vice versa. A lot of how you do in a class can depend on the teacher, can depend on what study material is out there, but I hope that you could just get a general idea of what to expect. I will promise you this, it is completely possible to do well in these classes. If I had to give one piece of advice, it would be to break up your task into little pieces. There were certain things, I keep saying this in the video, there were certain things I did as a freshman that I didn't do as a sophomore. That would be going to office hours, taking accountability for the stuff that I didn't understand, and taking up big projects and breaking it up into little pieces. I promise, as long as you fight procrastination, you will do fine. With all of that, thank you so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, subscribe down below. Make sure to follow her campus at UCD Instagram. With that, I will see you later. Bye-bye.